Welcome to the first of my 2 lectures on semantics. I guarantee you have never seen semantics approached in such a radical way before, so fasten your seatbelt, it's going to be a bumpy flight. The first of these lectures is about the semantics of sentences. The second is about sequences of sentences representing dialogues and mental models. This is the first lecture. Let's begin with a really radical claim. Most English sentences may be reduced entirely to just a series of simple X is Y and X has Y expressions, where X and Y are single words from the sentence. In practice, it doesn't matter in the slightest how complex the sentence is, what its clause structure is, what parts of speech it employs, what verbs and what verb tenses it uses. It can still be reduced to just a series of simple is and has expressions. You may find this difficult or even impossible to accept. You may even find the concept totally outrageous. I ask you to please be patient and continue to listen whilst I convince you that this really is the case. If you find my arguments convincing, I suggest they give clues to the inner meanings of to be and to have, the real nature of verbs, how our minds work and how we think and reason, the origins of human language, and finally, a path to conversational artificial intelligence, which is my own particular interest. So let's begin to see what this is all about, but I warn you, keep your seatbelt securely fastened. Let's begin by looking at a simple sentence. The bright red balloon has a long string with a knot. I hope you'll agree we can represent this sentence with short expressions like this. Balloon is red, red is bright, balloon has string, string is long, string has knot. I hope you'll agree that each expression is of the form X is Y or X has Y. Balloon is red, X is Y. Red is bright, X is Y. Balloon has string, X has Y. String is long, X is Y. String has knot, X has Y. Now we need to take a brief detour. If you look at the 2 expressions, balloon has string and string of balloon, I hope you'll agree that these 2 expressions are related and both imply the balloon has a string. In the second expression, the subject balloon and the object string change places and has is replaced by of. So I suggest that in many contexts, of behaves as a sort of inverse of has. So in these contexts, we may say X has Y implies Y of X, or Y of X implies X has Y. We're going to make use of these relations in what follows to clarify the underlying logic. Now let's try another example sentence. The train is inside the station. Let's try to analyse this sentence. We can make a start by saying train is inside, but then we get stuck, don't we? Or perhaps not. We can imagine that the station might have a booking hall and a platform reflected in the expressions station has booking hall and station has platform. So I wonder then, is it too outrageous to suggest that the station has an inside, reflected in the expression station has inside? If we can accept this idea, then now we can complete the analysis and say train is inside, station has inside. But using the previously discussed has of relation, we can say station has inside implies inside of station, which might sound rather more familiar. It may be rather pedantic, but we need to emphasize that with the expressions train is inside and station has inside, the inside is in fact the same inside in both expressions. We can show this relationship more clearly using what is called a semantic network, after the Greek philosopher Porphyry, as shown to the left. In this, the train, station and inside are nodes, and the is and has relationship are directed edges between these nodes. We are going to discuss semantic networks far more extensively in part 2 of these lectures. We can analyse in a similar way two further sentences. The road is beside the station and the station is beside the road. Looking at the road is beside the station, this breaks down into road is beside, station has beside, which is also expressible as beside of station, and then looking at the station is beside the road, this breaks down into station is beside, road has beside, also expressible as beside of road. Let's pause for a moment to have another look at these two sentences. The road is beside the station, as we've seen, breaks down into road is beside, station has beside, and the station is beside the road breaks down into station is beside, road has beside. Note that beside in the top two differs from beside in the lower two. This is because there may be other things beside the road which are not beside the station. Again, these relationships are brought out much more clearly using a semantic network. The semantic network to the left shows the beside associated with the road and the separate beside associated with the station. They're represented by different nodes on the semantic network. Here are another pair of similar sentences. The plane is above the station and the station is below the plane. And similarly with these, we can analyse the plane is above the station into plane is above, station has above, and the station is below the plane, analysed into station is below, plane has below. Note in these sentences how inside, beside, above and below have become features of the station, road and plane respectively, something that each has or possesses. The corresponding semantic network is shown again. This reinforces how above has become a feature of the station. That is something the station has. Similarly, below becomes a feature of the plane. That is something that the plane has. Let's now have a look at more general verbs. The verbs in the sentences so far have been based on to be or to have, represented by the declinations is and has respectively. Now we start to have a look at the more general verbs. Consider the sentence, Jack climbs up the hill. This looks rather daunting perhaps to convert to an is-has representation. So how on earth are we going to manage it? How are we going to go about it? Let's begin by converting the verb climbs in the sentence to the participle is climbing. This transforms the sentence to Jack is climbing up the hill. But wait, I can hear you say, doesn't Jack climbs differ slightly in meaning from Jack is climbing? This is very true. Jack climbs is case perfect, with some implication that the climbing is complete, whilst Jack is climbing is case imperfect, with some implication that the climbing activity continues. But I suggest in common parlance we wouldn't actually make a big deal out of the difference in meaning between Jack climbs and Jack is climbing. However, much later on in part 2 of these lectures, I will show how we can actually delineate this difference if we need to. For now, in the interests of simplicity, I'm simply going to ignore it. So our analysis of the sentence Jack is climbing up the hill begins as follows. Jack is climbing, the climbing is up, leaving us with the challenge of climbing the hill. I've left the up in parentheses since we've already to some extent dealt with it. Now, in a similar way to the train is inside the station example which we had earlier, we can imagine the hill has features such as grass and a tree, reflected in expressions such as hill has grass, hill has tree. I suggest climbing can also be regarded as a feature of the hill, reflected in the expression hill has climbing. So this idea now enables us to complete our analysis. We can say Jack is climbing, climbing is up, hill has climbing. At this point we can also use the has of inversion again, so that hill has climbing is changed to climbing of hill, which perhaps sounds more familiar. Let's look a little more deeply into the concept of Jack is climbing. You might be concerned about the phrase hill has climbing. Let's just think, if Jack was in space, away from any celestial or man-made body, could Jack do any climbing? I suggest not. Jack needs something to climb before he can climb. In our case, that something is the hill. The climbing is just as much a feature of the hill as it is of Jack himself. Well, I can understand you might still be concerned about the concept of hill has climbing, and I will deal with this topic at greater length later when we look at the real nature of verbs. I'll suggest then that verbs are much more subtle and complex entities than we perhaps appreciate. And finally, again, we have the semantic network representation of the analysis Jack is climbing, climbing is up, hill has climbing, representable as climbing of hill. So we can see the network representation on the left hand side there. Here's a rather more complex example reflected in the sentence Jack likes to tease Jill. This example is easier if reworded as Jack is liking the teasing of Jill, in parenthesis, his teasing of Jill, which results in the analysis Jack is liking, teasing has liking, which is also expressible as liking of teasing, Jill has teasing, expressible alternatively as teasing of Jill. In each case the liking is the same liking and the teasing is the same teasing. So the teasing is by Jack and not by somebody else. Here is the semantic network corresponding to the sentence Jack likes to tease Jill, which we reworded as Jack is liking the teasing of Jill. And with the analysis we had Jack is liking shown with the two nodes, the Jack and liking node linked by is. Teasing has liking. Again, we've got the liking and teasing nodes linked by has. And Jill has teasing, represented again by two nodes, Jill and teasing linked by has. This is an even more complex example. Jack gives the pail to Jill. This has a direct object, pail, and an indirect object, Jill. We can reword it as Jack is giving of the pail to, also expressible as towards, Jill, which results in the analysis Jack is giving, pail has giving, expressible as giving of pail. The giving is to, towards, Jill has to, towards. The to which Jill has is like an email inbox and represents something heading towards Jill but not quite got there yet. Again, we have the semantic network representation of the sentence Jack gives the pail to Jill, which we reworded as Jack is giving of the pail to Jill. And with the analysis we have Jack is giving, represented by Jack and giving nodes in the semantic analysis, linked by is. Pail has giving, again two nodes there, giving and pail linked by has. And finally the giving is to, represented by giving and two nodes linked by is. And in conclusion, Jill has to, represented by Jill and two nodes linked by has. Let's just have a review of some of the earlier topics and the sentences involved. We had the sentence, the train is inside the station, and we had the sentence, Jack is climbing up the hill, and then we had the sentence, Jack is giving the pail to Jill. Is there an argument which says that perhaps in the past, in the distant past, there was once an of associated with all these sentences, which over the course of time has been dropped? So was the first sentence once the train is inside of the station, Jack is climbing up of the hill, Jack is giving of the pail to Jill? If we feel that this is so, then by the has of inversion this further supports the concept of the station has inside, hill has climbing, and pail has giving. In conclusion, let's just contrast a couple of sentences. Jack is climbing a hill, where an of is absent between climbing and a, and where we've effectively dropped the of, and Jack is thinking of an idea, where we include the of rather than saying Jack is thinking an idea, where we'd consider dropping the of. I suggest this gives even further support to the concept of an of that has over the course of time been dropped from certain expressions. All the verbs we've encountered so far have been in the present tense. What we're going to do now is to examine how verbs in other tenses are handled. Let's just pitch the earlier sentence into the past tense by saying Jack climbed instead of Jack climbs to give the sentence Jack climbed up the hill. How can we tackle this? The first thing we do is to take tense out as a factor by rewording the sentence as in the past Jack climbs up the hill. Now the second part of the sentence is effectively in the present tense and can be analysed just as before to give Jack is climbing, climbing is up, hill has climbing. Then we reintroduce the past tense into our expressions, but not like this, which modifies the is and has expressions. Jack was climbing, climbing was up, hill had climbing, but like this, we say in the past, putting the past into parentheses, Jack is climbing, in the past, climbing is up, in the past, hill has climbing. The reason we do it this way is it retains the original pattern, which we will eventually find useful in part 2. In the semantic network representation of Jack climbed up the hill, we just flag the tense of each is and has relation as shown on the left hand side there. So the link between Jack and climbing in the network is flagged as past. The link between climbing and up is flagged as past also. And finally, in the link between hill and climbing, we also flag it on the network as past. In a similar way, we can pitch the earlier sentence into the future tense by saying Jack will climb instead of Jack climbs to give the sentence Jack will climb up the hill. And we found we can tackle this in a similar way to the past tense example. We can factor out the tense and reword the sentence as in the future Jack climbs up the hill, which results in the analysis future Jack is climbing, future climbing is up, future hill has climbing. Note that future is put into parentheses in front of each is has expression. Again, in the semantic network representation of the analysis shown on the left hand side, we just flag the links representing each is and has relation as being in the future. So we've got the link between Jack and climbing is flagged as future. The link between climbing and up is flagged as future, and finally the link between hill and climbing is also flagged as future on the network. Sometimes a sentence may contain a mixture of tenses, as in the example, the girl who won the race will receive a prize. And here is an analysis of this example. The first thing we do is reword it as, in the past, the girl is winning the race and in the future is receiving a prize. And we can then analyse this as, in the past, girl is winning, In the past, race has winning, which is also expressible as winning of race. In the future, girl is receiving. In the future, prize has receiving, also expressible as receiving of prize. Finally, we have the semantic network representation of the analysis of the sentence. And you can see in this representation that the link between girl and winning is flagged as being in the past. The link between race and winning is also flagged as being in the past. The link between girl and receiving is flagged as being in the future. And finally, the link between prize and receiving is also flagged as being in the future. We're now going to have a quick look at cardinals and ordinals as they appear in sentences. We cannot go too far with this topic because cardinals and ordinals need consideration of a mental model or ontology, and these are topics which are beyond this particular part of the lecture. This sentence gives an example of a cardinal. So we've got a lady has 3 cats with the cardinal 3. And here is how we analyse this. Lady has cat, cat is first, lady has cat, cat is second, lady has cat, cat is third. The shading shows that the lady is the same in all cases, and that there are pairs of yellow cat, green cat and grey cat references. To the left is the semantic network representation of a lady has 3 cats. So we've got lady has cat represented by 2 nodes, lady and cat linked by has. Cat is first, again the 2 nodes cat and first linked by is, and similarly for the further 2 cats there, we don't reintroduce the lady node, but we do add a further node for the second cat and a further node for the third cat, together with nodes for the ordinals second and third respectively. Now we can look at a sentence employing an ordinal. In this case, second. The second cat is wayward. The cats are identified as the first, the second and the third. So we can analyse the sentence like this. Lady has cat, cat is second, cat is wayward. Note that this sentence is referring to data provided by the previous sentence, which is where the mental model starts to come in. To the left you can see how the semantic network is modified by the sentence, the second cat is wayward. So you can see that on the network we've got lady has cat, cat is second, cat is wayward. So this second cat has been modified by the addition of a further node, wayward, linked to the second cat by the link is. From this network we can start to get some idea of how a mental model may be established based on a semantic network, and how this may then be modified as new information is received by the system. At this point we now have a quick look at sentences with clauses. Again, we cannot go too far because they need consideration of a mental model or ontology. And again, these are topics beyond this particular part of the lecture, in fact dealt with in the lecture part 2. Here we have an example sentence containing clauses. A balloon that is bright red has a string that is long with a knot. Here, that is bright red and that is long and with a knot are all clauses, and here is the resulting analysis. Balloon is red, red is bright, balloon has string, string is long, string has knot. As we can see in this particular case, the clauses do not influence the analysis, which is exactly the same as in the very first example given in this lecture. Importantly, although clause addition has not influenced our is-has analysis, the changed phrase order achieved by the clauses has enabled aspects of our personal view of the significance of the balloon and its string to be included in the sentence. We're going to return to a discussion of this aspect of sentence construction shortly. Let's now have a look at an example of a preposition. If I say Jack is buying a pail for Jill, you might ask the question, what does for mean here exactly? To do our analysis, we need to ascribe meaning to a preposition used in a context like this and other prepositions of a similar nature. I suggest here that for Jill means that Jill will have. The sentence therefore can then be analysed as, in the present, Jack is buying, in the present, pail has buying, expressible as buying of pail, and in the future, Jill has pail. Here's yet another part of speech, the possessive. If we say Jill's pail, what interpretation can we put on this? I suggest that the pail that Jill has, or more simply, Jill has pail. You might argue Jill's pail just implies ownership, not necessarily possession. But I suggest Jill has pail is just as imprecise, really. However, we must note, importantly, that if we refer to a participle with the possessive, as in the example Jack's climbing, the interpretation differs and becomes Jack is climbing rather than Jack has climbing. Hyphenation is a part of speech closely related to the possessive. If we say apple pie with a hyphen between the apple and the pie, an interpretation we can put on this is pie has apple, and similarly with other hyphenated expressions. For example, control hyphen room, room has control. Let's have a look now at some further examples of is-has analysis. Consider the sentence, this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, which comes from Humphrey Bogart in the film Casablanca. And we can analyse this as follows. This is beginning, friendship has beginning, also expressible as beginning of friendship, and finally friendship is beautiful. Here we have another sentence susceptible to is-has analysis. So we have the sentence, patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, which is a pronouncement due to Samuel Johnson. So this breaks down, I hope you can recognise, into patriotism is refuge, scoundrel has refuge, refuge is last. And here we have a final example, which is in fact the first line of the poem Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. So this breaks down into Khan is Kubla, Khan is decreeing, dome has decreeing, representable as decreeing of dome, dome has pleasure, also representable as pleasure dome with a hyphen between the pleasure and the dome. Xanadu has in and dome is in. At this point in the lectures we're going to take pause and just address a couple of issues. The first issue is the method of sentence analysis which we've been looking at so far entirely new? And the answer to this is not quite. In the 17th century, the Messieurs de Port-Royal, Arnaud and others, in their publication A General and Rational Grammar, analysed the sentence, "The invisible God created the visible world," and analysed it as, God is invisible, God created the world is visible. Clearly here in these lectures we go rather further than these principles. The second big issue that we address at this point is there a loss of information in the types of analyses that we've been carrying out? And the answer to this is that there certainly is a loss of information. If we look at the sentences, Jack is climbing the hill. The climbing of the hill is by Jack. The hill is being climbed by Jack. All have the same analysis. Jack is climbing, hill has climbing, also expressible as climbing of hill. We've clearly lost the stresses in the original sentences, showing those aspects of the topic that we considered most important, either Jack or the climbing or the hill. To put this another way, in the analyses of the sentence variants, Jack is climbing the hill, the climbing of the hill is by Jack, the hill is being climbed by Jack, which all result in the same analysis, Jack is climbing, hill has climbing. What we've done is we've retained the physical facts of the situation, but we've lost any personal views or opinions of those facts which were reflected in the original sentences. Another significant issue is that of exceptions. There are several sentence types where is has analysis alone is insufficient. Two of these types involve a sentence or phrase referring to another sentence or phrase, and a colloquial expression where the words used in the expression and its actual meaning differ. Look at the sentence, Jack says, Jill will carry the pail. This is an example of a sentence or phrase referring to another sentence or phrase. The phrase, Jill will carry the pail, is actually a sentence in its own right, referred to by the phrase, Jack says. We can only go so far in analysing a sentence of this type. We can analyse the sentence initially as follows. Jack is saying, corresponding to Jack says, and Jill will carry the pail has saying, also expressible as the saying of Jill will carry the pail. Then we can analyse Jill will carry the pail in the usual way to give in the future Jill is carrying and in the future pail has carrying. Here is another similar but rather more complex example of a sentence or phrase referring to another sentence or phrase with its consequent limitations on the analysis we can do on it. So we've got from Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, the initial sentence of this novel. It is a truth universally accepted that a young man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. By taking substantial liberties with Miss Austen's text, we have people believe a young man who has a good fortune wants a wife. And again, we have a young man who has a good fortune wants a wife is actually a sentence in its own right. So in this case, we can carry out two separate analyses on the initial and subsequent phrases, but we don't really have any way of linking them using the features and facilities which we've described so far. So starting off, people is believing, we change the R to is. Man has fortune, man is young, fortune is good, man is wanting, wife has wanting, also expressible as wanting of wife. At this point in the lecture, we're now going to take another detour, and we're going to examine the real nature of verbs. If you look in the dictionary defines a verb as a part of speech which asserts or predicates something, which I suggest doesn't really take us very far. We also sometimes encounter the alternative definition. A verb is a word that describes an action or a state of being. We can eliminate the latter, the state of being assertion, from our discussions since we've already associated it with to be and to have analysis, which we were dealing with separately. So let's continue to examine the real nature of verbs. Let's go back to the original example of Jack climbs with its participle form Jack is climbing. We noted that if, for example, Jack was in outer space, away from any celestial or man-made object, then Jack would not be able to climb anything. He'd be able to waggle his arms and legs about in a climbing motion, but he wouldn't actually be able to do any climbing. Jack needs a climbing environment for climbing to become possible. I suggest that it is quite impossible for us to visualize Jack is climbing without our minds automatically providing a vestigial imagined environment within which the climbing becomes possible. Extrapolating from this concept, I suggest this same situation exists for the majority of verbs. Most verbs demand an environment within which the action described by the verb becomes feasible. Walking demands a walking surface. Talking demands air in which sound waves can be propagated, and so on. So looking again at the real nature of verbs, I suggest we get so wrapped up in the act of performing the verb's action and the nature of the action itself, we forget the essential environment that is needed for the action to take place. So from this, I suggest we can now redefine most verbs along the following lines. A verb is a word that describes an action taking place within an environment capable of supporting that action. Okay, so having philosophized about the real nature of verbs in general, let's turn our attention now to the specific nature of the verbs to be and to have. The question must arise, what's so significant about to be and to have that their third-person declinations, is and has, are such dominant components in our analyses of sentences? Before attempting to answer this question, we must dispose first of a couple of issues. The first issue is that the main auxiliary verbs in English are based on to be, to have, and also to do. So is there any reason why to do has not popped up as significant in our analyses? We use declinations of to do as an auxiliary verb in the formation of three things. The first is negatives, as in the example, Jack doesn't climb up the hill. The second is questions, does Jack climb up the hill? And the third is emphatics, exemplified by Jack does climb up the hill. If you look at the first two cases, looking at negatives first of all, as in Jack doesn't climb up the hill, and then questions, does Jack climb up the hill? These are associated with dynamic operations on the mental model. Negatives are used to modify the existing mental model, and questions are used to interrogate an existing mental model. And because of these operations on the mental model, considerations of them are deferred to the Part 2 lecture. The third case, emphatics, Jack does climb up the hill, these are simply discarded as they just represent a personal view or opinion of the situation. And we've seen that this type of information is in fact discarded typically in our analyses. But we must note that on occasions to do appears as a verb in its own right, as in Jack is doing the washing, which gives Jack is doing, washing has doing, expressible as doing of washing. One further aspect of to do which we haven't so far discussed is very significant. The concept of to do may be associated with a list of instructions to achieve an objective. For example, if you look at the sentences, do go to supermarket X, do try to get the bread, if there is no bread, do go to supermarket Y, and so on. This particular aspect of to do parallels software programming. Note the conditional if sentence. However, each instruction is a sentence and could potentially be analysed using the very same techniques that we've been looking at so far. A consideration of the sequence of sentences constituting an instruction list is another topic which is deferred until the Part 2 lecture. Continuing with the nature of to be and to have, the second issue which we have to deal with is the big difference in the meaning of is in Jack is tall and Jack is a doctor. I suggest that the addition of a determiner after is in this case the article a, as in Jack is a doctor, as opposed to its absence in Jack is tall, completely changes the meaning of is. Note also that doctor is a noun whilst tall is an adjective. I suggest that in the case of Jack is tall, we have the association of a simple tallness property with Jack. But in the case of Jack is a doctor, we have a far more complex situation. So I suggest that somewhere, either in our minds, on paper or elsewhere, is a concept or a definition of a doctor. So we may feel a doctor is kind, a doctor is compassionate, a doctor has a degree, the degree is medical, and so on. So in our minds or elsewhere, we have a list of things that a doctor is and a list of things that a doctor has. So when we say Jack is a doctor, I suggest that we cause Jack to potentially inherit all these attributes, all these is and has things. So I suggest that by using the shorthand of Jack is a doctor, it avoids us having to say Jack is kind, Jack is compassionate, Jack has a degree, the degree is medical, and so on. But it's important to note that there may be a hierarchy of definitions, since as part of the Jack is a doctor definition, we may have Jack is a professional, leading to a further definition of a professional, and so on. This type of hierarchy again parallels software programming, and again further consideration is deferred until the Part 2 lecture. But I suggest we have to be careful though, because sometimes the determiner, in the previous case the article a, is absent from the sentence and is just implied. For example, we say Aristotle is Greek rather than Aristotle is a Greek. We can sometimes spot this absence of the determiner by checking if the complement is a noun rather than an adjective. So having dispensed with these two issues, let's now return to our consideration of the nature of the verbs to be and to have. Consider first the very much simpler concept of to be. I suggest that to be used without a determiner and with an adjective is mostly associated with things that we can directly sense. For example, the senses of sight and sound. We say is bright, is red, is round, is loud, is tuneful. Or other senses, is hot, is painful, is hungry, is thirsty. Or sensed emotions, is happy, is excited, is depressed. If you accept this idea, then shortly in connection with the origins of human language, I'm going to suggest why to be is associated with these things that we can directly sense. But now we're going to move on to consider the other verb, to have. I'm going to begin by suggesting that the verb to have is a phenomenally complex and powerful concept. I'm going to suggest that the concept of having forms the basis of all our mathematics, our science, and our engineering and much of our civilization in general. So the question is why? I suggest that once we start to embrace the concept of to have or having, then we are grappling with the concept that a thing can be composed of sub-things, that a component can be composed of subcomponents, that a heap or group can have individual members. Once we use the expression X has Y, we are flagging that Y is a sub-thing or a subcomponent or a member of X. I suggest that if we do not have this concept of having, then the only way we can select one sub-thing, one component, or one member is by effectively getting sufficiently close to it so that one component alone completely fills our sensory, typically visual field. We have effectively zoomed in on it. Once we have the concept that a thing can be split up into sub-things, then we soon realise that the sub-things can also be split up into sub-things, and so on, to any depth we choose. I suggest that a large part of physics is concerned with recognising that components may be split into subcomponents, that may be split into sub-subcomponents, and so on. But I suggest that this leads us into arithmetic. If we add one lot of sub-things to another lot of sub-things, then we move towards addition. If we remove some sub-things from a set of sub-things, then we have subtraction. If we order the sub-things of a thing and associate a different name with each sub-thing, we have counting. And finally, if we start to associate names with separate sets of sub-things, then we have algebra. And very soon algebra leads us into higher mathematics. So I very strongly suggest and repeat that the deceptively simple concept of splitting a thing up into sub-things or a component into subcomponents leads us into all our physics, mathematics, engineering and scientific technology generally. We cannot underestimate the tremendous power of the concept of to have. So if we accept the concept that sentences are reducible to sequences of is and has expressions, and of course you may choose not to accept this, then we may be able to speculate on the origins of human language. So ask the question, is it just possible that sentences are reducible to is and has expressions because each sentence is a coalescent of completely separate is and has utterances existing at the dawn of human language? In other words, is it now possible to break sentences down into a series of is and has expressions because at the dawn of human language, that's exactly how they started out, as a series of separate is and has utterances. We can perhaps imagine that gradually sequences of separate is and has utterances merged together to become sentences. It facilitated more rapid speech, of course. And that's exactly why we can take a sentence now and with some thought break it back down into the original is and has expressions. Well, at this point I ask the question, Are you convinced by the arguments which have been put forward? Or perhaps you still remain sceptical? If you are convinced, then as a conclusion to this lecture, we can briefly hazard a theory of human language origins. Let's begin by postulating three foundations for human language. The first two, I suggest, are features of many of the lower animals. The last, I suggest, is just a feature of ourselves and possibly some of the hominids. So here we go. The first foundation is a sense of sequence. We can detect that event A is often followed by event B. The second foundation is the already discussed is expression, reflected in expressions such as I am hungry, I am hurt, there is danger, I am angry. And the third foundation is the already discussed has expression. We know that something is composed of separate identifiable members. With the first foundation, a sense of sequence, we detect that event A is often followed by event B, sometimes described as a sense of causality. Your dog gets excited when you pick up the lead. He knows there's a good chance he's going to be taken for a walk. You can see the evolutionary advantage for any organism of being able to predict future events based on present events. I suggest, therefore, that this leads to a sense of past, present and future, that is, a sense of tense. If you think about it, any organism capable of detecting new event sequences needs quite sophisticated biological hardware and software, or should we say firmware. It has to keep a substantial record of events and do quite complex statistical analysis on this record to detect that B often follows A. An even more complex analysis is needed to detect that B follows A as long as C isn't present, and so on. I suggest the second foundation is the now familiar is expression, reflected in expressions such as I am hungry, I am hurt, there is danger, I am angry. If we think about it, primitive animal cries reflect these things. The animal directly senses something and reflects it in a sound, indicating hungry, hurt, danger, go away. One can imagine that with the coming of greater human vocal ability, these cries could become more sophisticated and become the is expressions that we know now. And finally, as the third foundation, we have the has expression. We've already quite extensively discussed the nature of this, which is possibly a unique human or hominid concept, and the reason why we have been able to develop possibly our science and technology from it. To these three foundations, we must also add the concepts of if and each, which are effectively variations of each other, together with the concepts of is a and its associated hierarchy, which we've already discussed, and finally to do, used with an associated set of instructions, which we've also mentioned. All of these topics involve consideration of the mental model and are again subjects which are explored in detail in part 2. Okay, we've now reached the conclusion of part 1 of this lecture. If you go on to examine part 2, then part 2 shows how we can build a mental model from a dialogue composed of a series of sentences, and how this then gives us a path to conversational artificial intelligence. So part 2 discusses dialogues, mental models, and the path to conversational artificial intelligence. You may be curious as to exactly how does the path to conversational artificial intelligence open up. And in very brief explanation of this, the is and has expressions from individual sentences of a dialogue may be melded to build the mental model. For example, if we determine that if A has B and later A has C, then A has B and C. If B and C happen to be the same thing, then A has 2BC. If X is a Y and we subsequently discover that Y is a Z, then X is a Z too. All of these topics are explored in far, far greater depth in the part 2 lecture. Okay, well, just one final note at the end of part 1 of this lecture series. The topics of both part 1 and part 2 of the lecture are explored in much greater detail and rigour in the book, which is published in 2021, Artificial Intelligence That Can Comprehend, by myself, which is available from Amazon.com.